Good morning, everyone, and I'd also like to say how pleased I am to be here, and was very pleased to get the phone call from Joe a couple of months back, so thank you. The collapse of our economy in 2008 was not a singular event. It was years in the making. Deliberate actions, such as light touch regulation on the banking sector, the lack of strategic thinking and physical planning, an over-cosy relationship with the construction sector, all contributed. Deliberate inaction since independence, on the other hand, resulted in the dysfunction of our political system and many of our key public services. When we had money, it was thrown at them rather than used for reform. Not only is political and institutional reform needed, it's expected by the citizens of the state. Firstly, we need to ask ourselves, what kind of institutions does a modern state require? And what checks and balances are needed to ensure that the institutions act in the interests of the citizens of a democratic state? And what is it about our political institutions that are broken? How do we go about redesigning them in a way that captures what is best about us as a people? How is that we have great local and national movements in practically every walk of life, yet our political institutions can best be described as mediocre? One explanation could be that we have no real cultural memory of institution building. The challenges of the new state when founded in the 1920s was such that stability and survival were understandably the immediate concerns. However, we can point to pre-Norman times and a set of laws formulated and guided by our ancestors. They were highly regarded because they were of the culture, and they're not inherited institutions. We know our state is highly centralised. We can fix that by decentralising power and introducing new functions to a radically, and I stress the word radically, reformed local government system, and by separating the executive from the legislature, as is the case in countries like France. I had expected the reform programme to have been predicated on a number of criteria, such as what's wrong with our public service and political institutions, and how do we fix those problems? How do we redesign these systems in a way that builds on our natural strengths, and we have many? How do we do this in a way that delivers quality services, in a way that we end up with a set of functioning institutions that are efficient, cost-effective, easily understood and engaged with, and most of all, citizen and community-centred? Currently, with few exceptions, it seems there's just one question driving the reform agenda, and that is, how can we save money? The silo-based approach to such cuts often results in savings being made on one side with costs incurred on the other, often producing poor outcomes and alienating citizens who are frustrated by the lack of vision and the lack of inclusiveness in the reform agenda. The lofty desire that existed prior to the general election that reform would deliver a set of political and public service institutions that would be fit for the 21st century has disappeared along the way, and it needs and can be recaptured. We need a higher level of ambition, which includes a vision of the kind of institutions we need, together with considering how they will interact with each other, what kind of culture those institutions foster, and what outcomes are desired. What concerns me is that we're seeing a piecemeal approach to reform driven primarily by cost cutting. And we do need to cut costs, and I acknowledge that. I was at a conference last year by Social Justice Ireland, and Tony Fahey, head of the School of Applied Social Science at UCD, gave a very inspiring paper, the title of which was Welfare and Debt, Lessons from Beveridge and His Times. The reason why it was so interesting was because it reminded us of the timing of Beveridge's visionary thinking around the creation of the welfare state in 1942, in the middle of the Second World War. He also addressed the post-war debt solutions and their outcomes, which are interesting in their own right to revisit. He told us that Beveridge believed that a revolutionary moment in world's history, is a time for revolutions, not for patching up. Unfortunately, there is no great big vision driving the so-called reform programme, which seems to be limited to one electoral cycle and lacks the long view that Beveridge took. Not only was he visionary, his system was hopeful at a time when people dared not hope. I believe we're at that unique moment in time, and we should not, and we cannot allow it to be wasted. If political reform is to bear fruit, I believe we need to look at the whole set of political institutions rather than take a piecemeal approach. I'm convinced that cannot be meaningful Dáil reform without local government reform. If we are to counter the excessive centralisation that dominates, we need a stable, functioning location to decentralise it to. In doing this, we need to work to our strengths. We have been capable of designing and building such organisations and institutions as the GAA, the Credit Union Movement, the Carers Association, just to mention a few. All were a response to a need and capture values such as solidarity, volunteerism, culture, care, etc. Each also functions within a defined geographic space that people identify with. Just imagine if we were to build on such elements into a reformed local government system. A system that is designed in such a way that allows the kind of flexibility to foster rather than stifle it. A system that that works in harmony with its people rather than grates against them. Despite the very many good people that work in our county council system, the first question that I am asking, and I'm asking you, is, do you think that our current county council system is that system? If not, do you think the county council system can be reformed into that system, or is something else needed? The counties, as we know them, were formed following the Norman invasion, and the formation occurred between the 12th and the 17th century. It mirrored what had happened in England. The counties were formed as a means of control by the Crown over such areas as taxation and the administration of justice. They are therefore not uniquely Irish, even though we've come to identify them, from the point of view of the GAA at least, we've come to identify with them. I question if they're part of the problem when it comes to local administration. Probably one of the features that is noticeable about the Irish disposition is we don't like being told what to do, and I think nearly every one of us will identify with that. Yet we've designed our political institutions, or at least accepted them, with control and centralisation at the centre. I was greatly impressed by the new urban living project that NUIM sociology department did a few years ago. They studied the emerging social fabrics of 4 new suburbs and satellite towns in the Greater Dublin region: Lucan, Leixlip, Mullingar and Ratoath, which were considered to be representative development patterns occurring throughout much of Ireland's cities and towns. The study found that attachment to place of local residents was influenced by 4 main factors: the built and natural environment, the cultural character and life of the area, the quality of informal associational life, and elective belonging, the reasons why people had chosen to live in their place of residence. I'm convinced we need to refashion our local government system in a way that really allows people to govern themselves in the place they actually identify with and the place that they have elected to live in. I also believe we need to decide what it is that local government should do and at what levels. In the UK, Sir Michael Lyons was commissioned to do an independent review of the UK's local government system a few years back. He concluded that place shaping, the creative use of powers and influence to promote the general well-being of community and its citizens should be the primary purpose of local government. When we think of community, we tend to think of it at a much lower level than at the county level. All the evidence is that communities, when left to their own devices, are incredibly responsible and incredibly resourceful. As public representatives, we have unique insights into how our citizens and communities function. We all have impressive stories of the get up and go that is visible, from sports to social enterprises in organisations which usually are run on a shoestring with huge voluntary effort. Look at this summer school, for example. I've long held the view it is at this level that we can unleash that genius by building into our governance the values that make our communities function. For me, that would take the form of a district council model. Engaging in a process of reform at district level provides opportunity to foster and utilise community engagement to enrich the development of the district and engage members of the community in the exercise of self-government in a manner not yet experienced. In an Irish context, this would mean encouraging communities to break with decades of misgovernment and overcome the fatal dependence of the intermediary in Irish politics, the middleman or middlewoman known as clientelism, which I'll come to in a few minutes. What is really dangerous, and we're seeing it at the moment, is that we have a dependent citizenry who know we can do better, but who feel both hopeless and powerless, and that must change if we're truly to begin to build a functioning civil society. A community-led as opposed to institutional-led model, where place shaping is the primary purpose of local government, should be at the foundation of our political institutions. In addition to the district council model, I also favour the establishment of an overarching regional tier, which would merge the existing county bureaucracies into a single set of authorities headed by a directly elected executive, similar to those located in the Nordic countries. We currently have a little-known regional tier which has limited functions. The proposed new authorities should be based around cities, I believe, Dublin, Cork and Galway, with perhaps no more than 3. There may be significant advantages, such as larger populated regions could achieve a lower per capita cost on expenditure on essential services, the hard services like water, waste, road maintenance, etc. Bigger regions could also eliminate the duplication of services provided across the present counties by amalgamating and centralising such functions as licensing, human resources, payroll, IT, etc. They would also have bigger purchasing power, in effect reducing costs, and perhaps over time achieve something that is a stated national desire, balanced regional development. This would be the delivery tier. Indeed, there is evidence from elsewhere that city regions are also very good economic drivers. The regions should also deliver a range of services, some not currently provided for by the local government system: transport, health, policing, spatial and environmental planning, childcare, elder care. The list goes on, but they're fairly normal. Fairly normal things that are dealt with in other countries at local government level. The value of introducing an autonomous district and regional tier of government would deliver a functioning local government system and would take the excessive localism out of our national parliament, which are essential components to reform. While I favour myself a unicameral system, I do so in the context that we first have, at the very least, to have a plan and commitment to reforms at local and national level with an agreed time frame. We need a functioning Dáil with a functioning and properly resourced committee system. One of the principal defects in how the Dáil functions is that there is no clear line between the executive and the Dáil itself. Basically, the government or executive has commandeered the function of the legislator. I just don't refer to this in administration. It has become custom and practice for the Dáil to be subservient to the timetable and the wishes of the government, which is the reverse of how it was intended to operate. The consequence is that between the executive and the permanent government, the civil servants, they are controlling everything. A good example is the timetable. What we're seeing is the excessive use of guillotines, late publication of bills, very brief time spans for tabling amendments, which are almost never taken by the government. And really this is an abusive process. How we do our budgets is a private matter between government and the civil service. We are promised that this would change. However, so far we've seen little evidence of this. If anything, it has become more centralised. The purpose of separating the two functions is to ensure that there is no unchecked power. The intention was that they exist and operate separately as standalone entities, but work in cooperation. Basically, we have a permanent government, which is the civil service. We then have a dynamic government which involves politics, which is there at the will of the people, and on occasions it's impossible to tell which is which. The role of political parties and the whip system is an issue. Article 40 of our Constitution sets out the rights that citizens may enjoy in a republic, including the right to form associations and unions. The Constitution makes no reference whatsoever to political parties, but is implied in the right to form associations. In the political sense, this has become to mean political parties, with only one model, it would seem, seen as valid, and is unfortunately designed and more or less reinforced to protect the traditional system. The excessive control by political parties in power is a misuse of power, and while I accept governments must govern, and that requires a majority, at least on economic matters, however, the monopoly of wisdom that was cautioned against on the first day of the current Dáil has become a reality. It impacts not just on the opposition, and perhaps impacts less on the opposition, but it limits input from the ranks of the government's own backbenches. The dire consequence for losing the whip, for example, excludes the deputy from speaking rights, membership of committees, access to systems funded by the taxpayer on the basis of the number of TDs that the party has had at election time. It's wrong. The person who is elected under the banner of a political party ceases, if they accept that whip system, to have independent thought of action, and I believe discredits politics. I'm going over time. I'll wrap up as quickly as I can. Dáil reforms to date have been superficial. They've been about box ticking, and really we need to address the fundamental issue, and the fundamental question is the relationship between the Dáil and the executive and the correct checks and balances. I said I'd return to the issue of clientelism. It seems that flourishes when citizens cannot easily navigate the various state institutions to access their entitlements. It fosters a type of middleman or middlewoman in the political system, where the focus is all about fixing the individual citizen's problem rather than fixing the system. And that must change. We almost regard government also as an external or other. We require a good middleman to interface with that power on our behalf. When we go into the polling booth, are we judging people on the basis of who can best govern us? Or are we thinking about who has the best skills as an intermediary between me and the nameless power that I have no influence over? If we are to change the political culture to focus on fixing the system rather than an individual's problem, I believe it would lead to a clash of ideas where real choices would emerge and politics becomes policy rather than personality driven. I just want to refer to one thing. Look, we can rob ideas from other locations. I was very impressed with a Norwegian system of e-government that produced huge savings, like, for example, 17% less hours were spent on administration with an investment. It did take an investment. But over 10 years, they've saved the equivalent of $7 billion US dollars on a system that has digitised and has replaced a lot of the traditional ways of doing things. Let's start looking at things that are good ideas elsewhere, and I think that it's a good example. But it has to be done in a way that people can engage with easily. Just to sum up then, Republican ideals require us to put the citizen at the centre, to design our systems in a way that inspires, facilitates and engages citizens in a way that makes the best use of our collective talents. I've set out, I hope, what is a snapshot of what I think some of the reform initiatives should be. We will soon commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Easter Rising and the foundation of our state. That was a revolutionary time. We are now in a different but revolutionary time. It is time for fundamental reform. We need to stop the patchwork and start rebuilding a better and more inclusive future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And we're going to hear now from